The dying sunlight cast long shadows across Katherine Tucker's face as she stared at the foreclosure notice clutched in her trembling hands. The harsh reality of her family's desperate situation finally crystallizing into something tangible and terrifying. 2 years of drought, her father's death, and her mother's lingering illness had brought them to this precipice. The Tucker family farm, homesteaded by her grandparents in 1868, would be auctioned off in 14 days unless she could produce the $300 they owed to the bank. Enid, Oklahoma Territory, 1889. The newly opened land was supposed to be their fresh start, but now it seemed like it would be their undoing. Catherine Katie, to most folks, folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket before heading back inside the small farmhouse where her mother rested, unaware that their world was crumbling. "Any mail worth mentioning?" her mother asked weakly from her bed in the corner of the main room. The consumption that had taken hold 6 months ago had reduced Eleanor Tucker to a shadow of her former self. Katie forced a smile. "Nothing important, Mama. How are you feeling today?" "Better, I think," she lied, the same as she did every day. "Did you check on the corn?" "Yes, Mama. It's coming along," Katie answered, another lie to protect her mother from the truth that their corn crop was failing just like everything else. That night, after her mother had fallen into fitful sleep, Katie sat at their worn kitchen table counting their meager savings, $42.16. Not even a sixth of what they needed. She had tried everything she could think of taking in laundry, selling eggs from their few remaining chickens, even sewing shirts for the mercantile in town, but none of it would generate enough money in time. The morning brought no relief from her worries. Katie fed her mother, tended to their remaining livestock, 2 milk cows, 3 chickens, and an old plow horse, and then made the decision she had been contemplating in her darkest moments. She put on her best dress, a faded blue cotton with only one patched tear near the hem, and pinned her honey-brown hair up as neatly as she could. "I'm going into town for supplies," she told her mother, kissing her forehead. "Mrs. Jenkins from down the road will look in on you while I'm gone." The 5-mile walk to Enid gave her plenty of time to reconsider, but every step only reinforced the terrible reality. There was only one commodity she possessed that might fetch enough money to save their home. Her father would have been horrified, but he was gone, and Katie was determined that her mother wouldn't lose her home too. Enid was bustling with activity, farmers bringing produce to market, cowboys from nearby ranches spending their pay in saloons, and the usual assortment of townspeople going about their business. Katie paused outside the Golden Nugget, the largest and most profitable saloon in town. It was owned by James Blackwell, a man with a reputation for employing pretty girls as entertainers and making arrangements for those willing to offer more private entertainment. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed through the swinging doors. The midday crowd was thin, a few men playing cards, others nursing glasses of whiskey. Behind the long bar, a heavy-set man with a waxed mustache looked up. "We don't serve women in here, miss," he said, not unkindly. "Unless you're looking for work." Katie swallowed hard. "I am." "Is Mr. Blackwell available?" The bartender studied her for a moment, then nodded toward a door at the back of the room. "Office is back there. Knock first." James Blackwell was nothing like she'd imagined. She'd pictured someone corpulent and greasy, but the man behind the desk was lean and almost distinguished, with silver at his temples and cold, calculating eyes that assessed her as if she were a horse at auction. "Well, well," he said after she'd stumbled through her introduction. "Katherine Tucker. I knew your father, honest man, terrible poker player." He leaned back in his chair. "What brings his daughter to my establishment?" "I need money, sir. Our farm, yes, I've heard about your troubles. News travels fast in a town like this. He circled around the desk and Katie fought the urge to step back. You're a pretty thing, not the usual sort who comes looking for this kind of work. I don't want to be a saloon girl, Katie said, forcing the words out. I need $300 in 2 weeks to save our farm. I'll do whatever I must. Understanding dawned in Blackwell's eyes, followed by a slow, predatory smile. My, that is quite an offer from a respectable young woman such as yourself. He reached out and touched a strand of her hair that had come loose. I might be able to arrange something. Several of my wealthier patrons would pay handsomely for the privilege of an evening with an untouched farmer's daughter. Katie felt sick but held her ground. I need the money first, to pay the bank. Blackwell laughed. That's not how this works, my dear. But I'll tell you what, come back tonight. I'll introduce you to some potential benefactors. Wear something prettier if you have it. She left the saloon feeling hollowed out but more determined than ever. This was her last resort, the only way to save the only home she'd ever known, and to ensure her mother wouldn't die heartbroken. What Katie didn't notice as she walked away was the tall figure who had been leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon, watching her exit with a troubled expression on his sun-weathered face. Nicholas James had not intended to overhear the conversation between the desperate young woman and James Blackwell. He'd merely been waiting for the saloon owner to discuss the sale of some cattle. But the thin walls of the saloon office had carried their voices clearly enough, and now Nick found himself in possession of knowledge he couldn't ignore. At 32, Nick had seen his share of hardship. Orphaned young and raised by his uncle on a struggling ranch in Texas, he'd worked cattle drives from the age of 14, before finally establishing his own modest but successful ranch 10 miles outside of Enid. He'd made it through drought, rustlers, and the general hardships of frontier life, but he'd never encountered a situation quite like this. He knew of the Tucker farm. Old man Tucker had been a good sort, hardworking and honest. Nick had even bought a horse from him once. The thought of his daughter selling herself to men like Blackwell's patrons didn't sit right with him. Instead of entering the saloon as planned, Nick turned and headed toward the Enid Territorial Bank. Banker Phillips looked up in surprise when the cowboy entered his establishment. "Mr. James, what can I do for you today? Your accounts are in good order, I believe." "It's not about my accounts," Nick said, removing his hat. "I want to inquire about the Tucker farm foreclosure." Phillips' eyebrows rose. "That's an unusual request. May I ask why you're interested?" "Let's just say I'm considering an investment," Nick replied, choosing his words carefully. "What's the outstanding amount?" "The Tucker place." Phillips shuffled through some papers. $300 in principal plus $42 in interest. They're set to foreclose in 2 weeks. Nick nodded, thinking rapidly. "I'd like to buy the debt." "Buy it? You mean pay it off?" "No," Nick corrected. "I want to purchase the debt from the bank, the full amount owed. The bank gets its money now and I become the creditor." Phillips looked confused. "That's an unusual request, Mr. James. May I ask why you wouldn't simply wait for the foreclosure and bid on the property then? It would likely go for less." Nick met the banker's gaze steadily. "My reasons are my own, Mr. Phillips. Is it possible or not?" "Well, yes. I suppose we could arrange it. The bank would certainly prefer guaranteed payment now rather than the uncertainty of an auction." Phillips began preparing the paperwork. "You understand this means you'd be responsible for collecting from the Tuckers, or foreclosing yourself if they can't pay." "I understand," Nick said, already formulating a plan. An hour later, Nick rode out of town with the Tucker debt in his saddlebag, having paid the full amount plus a premium to convince the reluctant banker. He wasn't entirely sure why he'd done it, only that the thought of Katherine Tucker in Blackwell's establishment made something in his chest tighten uncomfortably. Nick didn't ride directly to the Tucker farm. Instead, he returned to his own ranch to consider his next move carefully. The debt papers sat on his desk while he paced the floor of his modest but comfortable home, wondering what had possessed him to involve himself in a stranger's problems. Katie spent the afternoon in a fog of dread and determination, helping her mother eat a small bowl of broth before preparing to return to town. She had found her mother's old green dress, the one she'd worn to church, before she fell ill, and altered it hastily to fit her slightly smaller frame. It was the finest thing she owned, even if it was several years out of fashion. "You look lovely, dear," her mother said, watching her with puzzled eyes. "But why are you dressed up to go to town so late?" "There's a social at the church," Katie lied, hating herself for it. "Mrs. Jenkins said she'd stay with you until I return." "You should go and enjoy yourself," her mother encouraged, her face brightening at the thought of her daughter having some happiness. "You've been working so hard. Perhaps that nice Peterson boy will be there." Katie nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She kissed her mother goodbye and slipped out just as Mrs. Jenkins arrived, a kindly widow who had been helping them since her mother fell ill. The walk to town seemed shorter this time, each step bringing her closer to a decision she couldn't undo. The sun was setting by the time she reached Enid, painting the sky in fiery orange and deep purple. The Golden Nugget was lit up like a beacon, piano music and raucous laughter spilling out into the street. Katie paused outside, gathering her courage when a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Miss Tucker." She whirled around, startled, to find herself face to face with a tall cowboy. He was handsome in a rugged way, with dark hair beneath his hat and eyes that seemed to see right through her charade of confidence. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "My name is Nicholas James. I own the Circle J Ranch outside of town." He hesitated, then continued, "I believe we need to talk before you go in there." Katie's eyes narrowed. "Do I know you, Mr. James?" "No, madam," he admitted, "but I know what you're planning and I'm here to offer an alternative." Fear and embarrassment washed over her. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." His voice was gentle, not accusatory. "I was at the saloon earlier today. I overheard your conversation with Blackwell." Katie's face burned with shame. "That was a private matter." "Yes, it was," Nick agreed. "And under normal circumstances, I wouldn't interfere, but these aren't normal circumstances." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "I've purchased your debt from the bank, Miss Tucker." "You? What?" Katie stared at him in confusion. "The mortgage on your farm is now owed to me, not the bank," he explained. A cold fury replaced her embarrassment. "So you can foreclose yourself? Is that it? You've heard our land has good water access and thought you'd get it cheap." Nick shook his head. "No, madam. I bought it to give you more time. The bank wanted their money now. I don't." Katie regarded him suspiciously. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "I knew your father. Not well, but enough to know he was a good man. And—" Nick hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "And I don't think he'd want his daughter walking into that saloon tonight." Katie's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "What choice do I have? The farm is all my mother has left. I can't let her lose it." "You have a choice now," Nick said. "I'm offering you work. Real work at my ranch. I need help with the house, cooking for my ranch hands and keeping accounts. The pay is fair and you can work off the debt over time. And my mother, I can't leave her alone all day." "Bring her to the ranch," Nick suggested. "I have plenty of room, and the change of scenery might do her good. There's a doctor in Enid who visits my place regularly to check on one of my older hands. He could see to your mother as well." Katie stared at the cowboy, trying to detect the trap in his generous offer. "Why would you do this for strangers? What do you really want in return?" Nick met her gaze directly. "Nothing improper if that's what you're asking. I need the help and you need time. It seems like a fair arrangement to me. And if I refuse, then that's your right. The debt isn't due for another 6 months as far as I'm concerned. That should give you time to find another solution." He handed her the document. "Read it for yourself. I've extended the terms." Katie took the paper with trembling hands, unfolding it to see her family's debt now transferred to Nicholas James, with a new due date 6 months in the future. It seemed impossible, a miracle appearing out of nowhere just when she needed it most. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Sometimes people help each other, Miss Tucker. That's all." He replaced his hat. "Think about my offer. I'll be at your farm tomorrow morning to hear your decision." With that, he nodded politely and walked away, leaving Katie standing outside the saloon with the debt paper clutched in her hands. She looked at the Golden Nugget's swinging doors, then down at the document again. Without another thought, she turned and began the long walk home, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The next morning, Nick arrived at the Tucker farm as promised. The place showed signs of neglect, fence posts leaning, barn roof missing shingles, fields only partially planted, but he could see it had once been well maintained. The bones of a good farm were still there. Katie was waiting for him on the porch, her face showing signs of a sleepless night but her eyes clear and determined. "Mr. James," she greeted him as he dismounted. "Miss Tucker," he replied, removing his hat. "Have you given my proposal some thought?" "I have," she nodded. "I'll accept your offer with one condition." "And what might that be?" "I want a contract," she said firmly. "Something in writing that states exactly what my duties will be, what you'll pay, and how it applies to our debt. And I want the right to continue working our farm in whatever time I have left." Nick couldn't help the smile that tugged at his mouth. She had spirit, this one. "That seems reasonable. I'll have the paperwork drawn up in town today." "Then we have an agreement," Katie said, extending her hand to shake his. Nick took her hand, noting its strength despite its smallness. "We do. When can you and your mother be ready to move?" "Give us 2 days to prepare," Katie requested. "And thank you, Mr. James. I don't know why you're helping us, but I'm grateful." "Call me Nick," he said, releasing her hand. "And you're welcome, Miss Tucker." "Katie," she corrected with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "If we're to be working together, you might as well use my name." 2 days later, Nick arrived with a wagon to transport Katherine, her mother, and their few belongings to his ranch. Alina Tucker was frailer than Nick had expected, and he chastised himself for not bringing his foreman's wife, Sarah, to help with the journey. But Katie managed her mother's transfer to the wagon with practiced ease, making her comfortable on a bed of quilts in the back. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Tucker," Nick said, tipping his hat to the older woman. "You're very kind to help us, Mr. James," Alina replied, her voice weak but her eyes still bright. "Katie tells me you knew my husband?" "Yes, madam. He sold me a fine horse a few years back. Best mount I ever had," Alina smiled. "That sounds like Edward." He always did have an eye for good horses. The journey to the Circle J took nearly 2 hours, during which Nick learned more about the Tuckers. They had moved to the Oklahoma Territory during the land run of 1889, staking their claim and building from nothing. Edward Tucker had been a skilled farmer who'd managed to coax crops from the sometimes unforgiving soil, and Alina had been a schoolteacher before marrying and helping on the farm. "Katie was always her father's shadow," Alina said proudly. "Learned everything about farming from him. She could have run that place herself if the drought hadn't been so severe." Nick glanced at Katie, who was riding beside the wagon on her family's old plow horse. She sat tall in the saddle, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, a habit of someone used to watching for trouble. The Circle J Ranch came into view as they crested a low rise, a sprawling main house, bunkhouse, barn, corrals, and various outbuildings spread across a valley with a creek running through it. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and several cowboys were visible working in the distance. "It's beautiful," Katie said, unable to hide her admiration. "It's home," Nick replied simply. "Took me 15 years to build it up from nothing." He helped her lean her into the house first, showing her to a comfortable bedroom on the ground floor that had been prepared for her arrival. Katie followed with their bags, her eyes wide as she took in the unexpectedly well-appointed interior of the ranch house. "This will be your room," Nick said, opening a door across the hall from her mother's. "The kitchen is through there, and my room is upstairs. Sarah, my foreman Tom's wife, will be by later to help get you settled. She helps with the cooking when we have a full crew, but she's been hoping for more regular help." "It's very generous," Katie said, setting down her bag. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow is soon enough," Nick assured her. "Today, get your mother comfortable and rest yourself. We rise early here. Breakfast for the hands is at 5:30. Left alone, Katie took stock of her new situation. The room was simple but far more comfortable than what she'd had at the farm, a real bed with a proper mattress, instead of a straw tick, a washstand with a porcelain bowl and pitcher, even a small bookshelf with several volumes. It felt strange to be accepting such charity, but she reminded herself it wasn't charity, it was employment. She would work for every penny. The next morning, Katie rose before dawn, dressing quickly in her work clothes and pulling her hair back in a practical braid. She found her way to the kitchen and was surprised to find Nick already there, building up the fire in the cook stove. "Good morning," he said, straightening up. "I was just getting things started." "You cook?" Katie couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Nick chuckled. "I lived alone for years before hiring hands. Had to learn or starve." He gestured to the pantry. Sarah left things organized, biscuits and gravy, eggs and coffee for breakfast usually. "The men work hard, they need the fuel." Katie rolled up her sleeves. "I can manage that, you don't need to stay." "I'll help this first morning," he insisted, reaching for a sack of flour. "Show you where everything is." They worked side by side, falling into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. Nick was competent in the kitchen, and Katie found herself impressed by his lack of pretension about what some men might consider women's work. The ranch hands began filing in at 5:30, weather-beaten men of varying ages who greeted Nick with respect and Katie with curious but polite nods. Nick introduced her simply as Miss Tucker, who will be helping around the ranch, and the men seemed to accept this without question. After breakfast, Nick showed Katie the ledgers he kept for the ranch's accounts. "I'm not much for bookkeeping," he admitted. "Tom handles most of it, but he's got his hands full with the cattle. If you could take this over, it would be a big help." Katie examined the books, noting several inconsistencies and disorganized entries. "I can fix this," she said confidently. "My father taught me to keep proper accounts. We may not have had much, but we always knew exactly what we had." Nick smiled, pleased by her competence. "Good. I'll leave you to it then. I need to check on the herd in the north pasture." He paused at the door. "Oh, and the doctor will be by this afternoon to see old Jenkins. I've asked him to look in on your mother as well." After he'd gone, Katie settled into the unexpected luxury of a proper desk and chair, immersing herself in organizing the ranch's financial records. The work was satisfying, using her mind in a way she hadn't been able to during the desperate months of trying to save the farm. Sarah, the foreman's wife, arrived mid-morning, a robust woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense manner and kind eyes. She helped Katie prepare lunch for the hands, showing her the routines of the ranch house. "The boss is a good man," Sarah told her as they worked. "Fair and honest. Treats his hands well, not like some ranchers around these parts." "How long have you worked for him?" Katie asked. "Going on 8 years now. Tom and I were in a bad way when we met Mr. James. Our place in Kansas failed, and we were headed to California when our wagon broke down near here. He gave Tom work, then me too when he found out I could cook." Sarah kneaded dough with strong, capable hands. "Changed our lives, he did." Katie wasn't surprised to hear it. In the short time she'd known Nick James, she'd sensed he was a man who helped others not for glory or advantage, but because it was simply his nature. The doctor's visit that afternoon brought both relief and sorrow. Dr. Wilson was thorough in his examination of Alina, but his expression when he emerged from her room told Katie what she had feared for months. "The consumption is quite advanced, Miss Tucker," he said gently once they were alone in the hallway. "I'm afraid there's not much to be done except make her comfortable." "How long?" Katie asked, her voice steady despite the pain in her chest. "A few months, perhaps. It's hard to say. The dry air here might help ease her breathing somewhat, but—" He trailed off, his meaning clear. "Thank you for your honesty, Doctor," Katie said, blinking back tears. When Nick returned that evening, he found Katie sitting on the porch, watching the sunset with red-rimmed eyes. Without a word, he sat beside her, offering silent companionship as the sky turned from gold to deep purple. "The doctor says she doesn't have long," Katie finally said, her voice barely audible. Nick nodded. "I'm sorry, Katie. At least she's comfortable here. She said it reminds her of the house she grew up in back east." Katie turned to look at him. "Why are you doing all this?" "The truth this time, not just because you knew my father." Nick was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "When I was 16, my parents died of fever within a week of each other. Our small farm in Texas was failing and the bank took it immediately. No grace period, no compassion. I ended up working cattle drives, sleeping rough, scraping by until I could save enough to start my own place." He looked out at his ranch. "I always swore if I ever made something of myself, I'd never be the kind of man who profited from another's misfortune." Katie studied his profile in the fading light. "That still doesn't explain why you went out of your way for us specifically." Nick met her gaze. "When I saw you heading into Blackwell's place, knowing what you were about to do, I couldn't just ride away." Some things a man can't ignore and still call himself a man. The simple honesty of his answer touched something deep within Katie. "Well, whatever your reasons, I'm grateful, and I promise I'll work hard to repay you." "I know you will," Nick said with a small smile. "I've seen your determination." The days turned into weeks, and Katie found herself settling into life at the Circle J. She brought order to the ranch's accounts, helped Sarah with meals, tended to her mother, and even found time to ride out with Nick occasionally to check fences or move cattle. She discovered he was a patient teacher, showing her the workings of the ranch without ever making her feel incapable or out of place. Alina seemed to rally somewhat in the new environment, gaining enough strength to sit on the porch on fine days and even join them at the dinner table occasionally. She took a particular liking to Nick, often engaging him in conversation about books or sharing stories of her days as a teacher. "You've got yourself a fine young man there," Alina told Katie one evening as her daughter helped her prepare for bed. "He's not my young man, Mama," Katie protested, though she felt her cheeks warm. "Perhaps not yet," Alina said with a knowing smile. "But I've seen how he looks at you when you're not watching, and how you look at him, for that matter." "Don't be ridiculous," Katie mumbled, though she couldn't deny that her feelings toward Nick had evolved from gratitude into something deeper and more complicated. His quiet strength, his unfailing kindness, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, all of it had become precious to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, in late August, Katie was working in the garden behind the house when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she was startled to see James Blackwell riding up to the house, accompanied by two rough-looking men. Nick emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag as he walked to intercept the visitors. Katie moved closer, staying partially hidden behind the garden fence but close enough to hear. "Blackwell," Nick greeted the saloon owner coolly. "What brings you out to the Circle J?" "Just being neighborly, James," Blackwell replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you'd taken in the Tucker girl, wanted to see how she was settling in." "Miss Tucker is employed here now. She's doing well." Nick's stance was casual, but Katie could see the tension in his shoulders. "Employed," Blackwell chuckled. "Is that what they're calling it these days?" "I have to hand it to you, James. You found a clever way to get what you wanted. Buy her debt, move her in." "Very smooth." Nick's expression hardened. "You do well to watch your words, Blackwell." "Oh, come now." "We're both men of the world," Blackwell continued, oblivious to the danger in Nick's tone. "I merely came to make an offer. Whatever you paid for the Tucker debt, I'll double it. The girl had a proposition for me that I'm still interested in pursuing." Katie's blood ran cold at the implication, but before she could react, Nick had moved with surprising speed, grabbing Blackwell by his expensive coat and nearly pulling him from his horse. "Miss Tucker is under my protection now," Nick said, his voice low and deadly calm. "If I ever hear you've spoken of her that way again, or if you come near her, we'll have a reckoning that won't end well for you. Do we understand each other?" Blackwell's face had gone pale, his companions too surprised to intervene. "Perfectly," he managed to say. Nick released him, stepping back. "Good, now get off my land." After the unwelcome visitors had departed, Katie stepped out from her hiding place. Nick turned, his expression softening when he saw her. "You heard," he said. "It wasn't a question." Katie nodded. "Thank you for defending my honor." "Blackwell's a snake," Nick said, his jaw still tight with anger. "But he won't bother you again." Katie studied him, seeing something new in his fierce protectiveness. "You called me Miss Tucker is under my protection. What did you mean by that?" Nick looked slightly embarrassed. "I just wanted to make it clear that you're not alone anymore, that you have someone looking out for you." "Is that all it was?" Katie asked, taking a step closer to him. Nick met her gaze, something shifting in his eyes. "No," he admitted quietly. "That's not all it was." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Katie realized she was holding her breath, waiting for something she couldn't name. Before either could speak again, Sarah called from the house that a leaner was asking for Katie, breaking the spell. Katie reluctantly turned away, but the memory of Nick's expression, open, vulnerable, filled with something that made her heart race, stayed with her for the rest of the day. As September gave way to October, Eleanor's health began to decline more rapidly. Katie spent more time at her bedside, reading to her or simply holding her hand as she slept. Nick ensured the doctor visited regularly and ordered special medicines from as far away as Kansas City to ease her pain. One crisp autumn evening, Nick found Katie sitting alone by the creek that ran through the property, watching the water flow over smooth stones. "Your mother's resting comfortably," he said, sitting beside her on the bank. "Sarah's with her." "Thank you," Katie replied, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the evening chill, "for everything you've done for her, for us." "There's no need to thank me," Nick said. He hesitated, then added, "I've been meaning to talk to you about the farm." Katie tensed. "What about it?" I rode out there yesterday, he admitted. The place needs work, but it's still a good piece of land. The well is sound and the soil in the bottom field is prime. Why were you out there? Katie asked, confused. I've been thinking, Nick said carefully. Once your mother. Once this difficult time has passed, you'll need to decide what to do next. I want you to know that the farm is still yours. The debt to me can be worked out over time, or... He trailed off. Or what? Nick took a deep breath. Or we could combine our operations, my cattle, your cropland. It would make good sense from a business perspective. Katie stared at him, trying to understand his meaning. Are you proposing a business partnership, Mr. James? A small smile tugged at his mouth. Not exactly, Miss Tucker. He turned to face her fully. I'm not good with fancy words, Katie. But these past months, having you here, it's made me realize what I've been missing. I never thought much about having a family of my own until I met you. Katie's heart began to pound. Nick, I'm not asking for an answer now, he hurried to add. Your mother needs you, and you have grief ahead. I just wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you could ever see your way to considering a future with me, I'd be honored to build that future together. Tears filled Katie's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. I don't need time to consider it, she said softly. My mother was right. She saw it before I would admit it to myself. Saw what? Nick asked, hope flickering in his eyes. That I've fallen in love with you, Katie whispered. Your kindness, your strength, the way you've respected me from the beginning. How could I not? Nick's face transformed with joy. Gently, he reached out to cup her cheek in his calloused hand. May I? He asked, his gaze dropping to her lips. Katie nodded, and he leaned in to kiss her softly, reverently, as if she were something infinitely precious. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. We'll wait, he murmured, until after. There's no rush. I'd like my mother to know, Katie said. To see that I'll be taken care of, that I'll be happy. Nick nodded. Then we'll tell her together. Alina's joy at their news gave her a brief resurgence of energy. She insisted on helping plan for a spring wedding, making lists and offering advice that Katie treasured all the more for knowing their time together was limited. He's the kind of man your father would have approved of, Alina told Katie one evening as they looked through her old trunk for family keepsakes. Strong but gentle, principled. She pulled out a small velvet box. I want you to have this now. It was my mother's, then mine. Now it should be yours. Inside was a delicate gold locket containing a tiny daguerreotype of Alina as a young woman. It's beautiful, Mama, Katie said, fastening it around her neck. A piece of me to keep with you, Alina said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. So proud of the woman you've become, Katherine. So proud. 2 weeks later, with the first snow of winter dusting the ground, Katherine Tucker passed peacefully in her sleep, Katie holding one hand and Nick the other. They buried her in the small cemetery in Enid, next to Edward Tucker's grave, with the ranch hands serving as pallbearers and the entire community turning out to pay respects. The grief was profound, but Katie found strength in Nick's steady presence, and in the knowledge that her mother had died knowing her daughter would be loved and cared for. Winter settled over the ranch, the quiet season when cattle required less attention and the pace of life slowed. Katie and Nick spent the long evenings planning their future improvements to both the ranch and the farm, which crops to plant in spring, how to merge their operations most efficiently. I've been thinking about names, Nick said one night as they sat before the fire in the main room, Katie mending a shirt while he cleaned his saddle. Names, for the combined property, he clarified. Circle J doesn't quite cover it anymore. Katie considered this. What about the Tucker James Ranch? Nick smiled. I like the sound of that, though soon enough you'll be Katherine James too. Katherine James, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It sounds right somehow. "It does," he agreed, setting aside his work to move beside her on the sofa. "Just as right as this feels." He drew her into his arms, kissing her with growing passion that still held an element of restraint, the restraint of a man determined to honor the woman he loved until their wedding day. When spring finally arrived, bringing with it new grass for the cattle and warm days perfect for planting, Katie and Nick were married in the same church where her parents had worshipped. The entire ranch turned out for the celebration, along with half the town of Enid. "Never seen the boss so happy," Tom commented to his wife as they watched the newlyweds dance at their reception. "It was meant to be," Sarah replied confidently. "From the moment he brought her here, I knew." As the sun set on their wedding day, Nick took Katie home to the ranch, their ranch now, truly. In the privacy of their bedroom, they came together as husband and wife, their love expressed in touches both tender and passionate. "I never thought I could be this happy again," Katie whispered afterward, nestled in the circle of Nick's arms. "After losing my parents, I thought that part of my life was over." "Life has a way of surprising us," Nick murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Just when you think you've lost everything, you find something you never even knew you were looking for." Over the following year, the Tucker-James Ranch flourished under their combined care. Katie's knowledge of crops complemented Nick's expertise with cattle, creating an operation more successful than either could have achieved alone. They rebuilt and expanded the Tucker farmhouse, keeping it as a second home and a place to grow their wheat and corn while maintaining the Circle J as their primary residence. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Katie gave birth to a son they named Edward Nicholas James, after both their fathers. Nick proved to be as gentle and devoted a father as he was a husband, often carrying the baby with him around the ranch in a sling Sarah had fashioned. "You're spoiling that boy," Katie teased as she watched Nick show their son the new foals in the corral. "Can't help it," Nick admitted with a grin. "Never thought I'd have this, Katie. A son, a wife I adore, land that's thriving. Sometimes I wake up afraid it's all been a dream." "Not a dream," Katie assured him, sliding her arms around his waist. "Just a life better than either of us imagined possible." As young Edward grew, so did the ranch's prosperity. By their 5th anniversary, they had added a daughter, Eleanor Sarah, to their family and expanded their holdings to include adjacent land when a neighboring rancher decided to move to California. On the anniversary of the day Nick had first offered Katie work, instead of allowing her to sell herself to save the farm, they rode together to the spot by the creek where he had later proposed. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Katie asked as they spread a blanket for a picnic. "If you hadn't been at Blackwell's that day," Nick's expression grew serious. "I try not to. The thought of what might have happened to you." He shook his head. "But then I remind myself that you're the strongest woman I've ever known." "You would have found a way through, no matter what." Katie smiled, touching the locket that still hung around her neck, her mother's gift. "Perhaps, but I'm grateful every day that I didn't have to find out." She leaned against him, watching their children play at the creek's edge under Sarah's watchful eye. "You saved more than our farm that day, Nick. You saved me from losing myself." "You saved me too," he replied, his arm tightening around her, "from a life half lived. From never knowing what it means to love someone completely." He turned to kiss her, still with the same tenderness as their first kiss. "Best investment I ever made," Katie laughed, the sound bright in the clear afternoon air. "Is that what I am? An investment?" "The only one that ever truly mattered," Nick assured her, drawing her close again as their children's laughter echoed across the land that had brought them together, land that had once been a burden, but had become the foundation of a life filled with love, family, and the kind of happiness that neither had dared to dream possible. Years later, when their children were grown and the Tucker-James Ranch had become one of the most respected operations in the territory, Katie found the old mortgage paper Nick had purchased that fateful day. It was yellowed and creased from being folded and unfolded many times, a tangible reminder of where their story had begun. "Remember this?" she asked, showing it to Nick as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset as had become their evening ritual. Nick took the paper, his fingers more gnarled now but still strong, tracing the faded ink. "How could I forget? The best $342 I ever spent." Katie rested her head on his shoulder, her hair now streaked with silver that matched his own. "Who would have thought that a debt could lead to such riches?" "I knew," Nick said simply. "The moment I saw you standing outside that saloon, gathering your courage to do the impossible for your family, I knew you were a woman worth risking everything for." As darkness settled over the land, they'd nurtured together through drought and plenty, sorrow and joy. Katie reflected on the long, winding path that had brought them to this moment of quiet contentment. From the desperation that had driven her to sell herself, to the unexpected salvation offered by a cowboy with principles as solid as the ground beneath their feet, their love had been forged in the crucible of hardship and emerged stronger for it. "I love you, Nicholas James," she said, the words no less heartfelt for having been spoken countless times over their decades together. "And I love you, Katherine James," he replied, as certain as the stars now appearing overhead. "Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows."